President Trump threatens China. Bernie Sanders gets China wrong. And a secret recording of Hong Kong's chief executive. This is China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. We've entered a new phase in the U.S.-China trade war. On September 1st, the first in a new round of tariffs against China went into effect. 15% on $112 billion worth of goods. That means about 2/3 of Chinese imports are now being taxed. Thankfully, that doesn't include everyone's favorite seasonal Chinese import, pumpkin spice mooncakes. Hey, it could happen. There's already a spicy chicken mooncake. It's filled with real chicken and real regret. Anyway, by December 15th, virtually all Chinese imports will be taxed when the second round of new tariffs goes into effect. That will be 15% on another $160 billion worth of imports. And President Trump is warning China things can get much worse. Even worse than spicy chicken mooncakes. But the Chinese Communist Party is playing a waiting game, hoping things will get worse for Trump instead. They hope Trump will lose the 2020 election, and someone more favorable to Beijing will be elected. Obviously, Trump is pretty confident in himself. He tweeted that when he wins re-election, a trade deal will get much tougher. Tougher than a Trump steak served well done. Meanwhile, according to the latest data, the trade gap between the U.S. and China is actually getting smaller. And both sides are now meeting again for more trade talks in October. Of course, as we've already seen, actually getting a trade deal won't be easy. And as former U.S. Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis said at a recent talk at the Council on Foreign Relations, just look at Hong Kong.
And watching what's going on in Hong Kong right now, their authoritarian mode against their own people, it takes a real stretch of imagination to say they would treat foreigners better than they'd treat their own people at home.
The U.S.-China trade war isn't just about trade imbalances. In a way, it's an ideological battle between America's free market model and China's communist model. The Chinese Communist Party has used illegal trade practices, intellectual property theft, and currency manipulation to boost the Chinese economy at the expense of American workers. The most recent example, according to the Wall Street Journal, the Chinese telecom giant Huawei is being investigated over new allegations of technology theft. Huawei was accused of stealing intellectual property from multiple people and companies over several years. This is obviously really unfair. The U.S. calling out China, I mean. Obviously, that's why China is taking the U.S. to court. China has lodged its third complaint about tariffs to the World Trade Organization. It's a strange move considering how many times the U.S. has lodged complaints about China to the WTO, complaints China simply ignored. So the Chinese regime should have first-hand experience with how toothless one of those WTO complaints can be. But don't worry, the Chinese regime is taking steps to ensure you'll be seeing fewer stories about technology theft, like this one from the Wall Street Journal. No, not because they're going to stop stealing. They just banned a Wall Street Journal reporter. Much easier. Another sticking point in the trade war is actually China's drug war against the United States. President Trump has been complaining that Chinese leader Xi Jinping has not honored his agreement to block shipments of fentanyl from China. Of course, China's top drug enforcement official has said that's not true at all. In April, China said it would ban all forms of fentanyl, cutting the supply to the U.S. But they never specifically said they wouldn't ship it to Mexico and use drug cartels to smuggle it across the border. Speaking of mysterious substances turning up, China's lunar rover has apparently found a mysterious and strange shiny gel on the moon. Here's a picture of it. Wait, no, that's just the crater they say they found the mysterious gel in. They haven't actually released any photos of the gel itself yet. But they say it's there, so take their word for it. When have they ever lied? And we'll be right back after the break with more China Uncensored. Stay tuned. This is China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. This week's China News headlines. Presidential hopeful Bernie Sanders was one of the first U.S. senators to come out hard against China. Here he is in 1994, arguing against granting China most favored nation trade status.
Mr. Speaker, when multinational corporations throw American workers out on the street and move to China, where workers are paid 15 cents an hour, where slave labor exists, where basic democratic rights are ignored, where workers cannot organize free trade unions. That scenario may be good for the profit margins of the large corporations, but it is a disaster for American workers. It is absurd to be talking about most favored nation status for a country which allows for the ruthless exploitation of its workers.
Wow. If Twitter had existed in 1994, Donald Trump would have tweeted pretty much the same thing. So, what does Sanders think now?
I think China is a country that is moving, unfortunately, in a more authoritarian way in a number of directions.
Well, they've been authoritarian since the beginning, but carry on.
But what we have to say about China, in fairness to China and its leadership, is, if I'm not mistaken, they have made more progress in addressing extreme poverty than any country in the history of civilization. Okay, so they've done a lot of things for their people.
Oh, Bernie. Yes, they've done a lot of things for their people, like the slave labor and ruthless exploitation of workers you mentioned back in 1994. Unfortunately, it seems Sanders may have fallen victim to a common piece of Communist Party propaganda. China has lifted more than 700 million people out of poverty. Yes, the Chinese Communist Party is like a giant arcade claw machine, gently lifting millions of Chinese people out of poverty. The thing is, if you're lifting something out of Chinese state-run media, you probably can guess it's not really true. I gave a full rundown of why this isn't true in the episode China's Poverty Lie. But to be brief, the Chinese Communist Party destroyed the entire Chinese economy in the 1950s in their attempt to enforce collective farming and steel production. When that failed miserably and ended in the deaths of millions, they launched the Cultural Revolution. That also failed miserably and ended in the deaths of millions. Then, after Chairman Mao died, the new leader, Deng Xiaoping, decided to scale back some of those failed collectivization policies. He gradually allowed people to buy and sell and do business again. Given this little bit of market-based economic wiggle room, Chinese people lifted themselves out of poverty. They got an even bigger boost when jobs started coming in from all those multinational corporations Sanders talked about in 1994. But even despite allowing private enterprise, 900 million people in China still make less than $10 a day. But Chinese authorities categorize most of them now as low income, so technically, they're not in poverty. Oh, and note that every time China releases their annual white paper on human rights, it focuses on how many people it's lifted out of poverty, claiming that's the most important human right. Which is to say, as long as people seem less poor than they were 40 years ago, human rights in China are improving. Look, economically, Chinese people are doing better than they were when Mao died, and that's a good thing. But the propaganda is when the Chinese Communist Party takes all the credit for lifting people up and then also tries to use it to cover up their human rights crimes, like Xinjiang's re-education camps. Those people aren't being tortured, they're being lifted out of poverty. Hopefully Sanders' economic plan doesn't take inspiration from China's poverty elimination. The Pentagon is accusing China of bullying tactics against Vietnam. Yes, the Pentagon is standing up for Vietnam, the communist regime they tried so hard to defeat half a century ago. But now, of course, there's a scarier communist regime. A Chinese survey vessel entered Vietnam's exclusive economic zone on Saturday. It claimed to be doing a seismic survey. You know, for science. Nothing to do with all the oil that's there. The Pentagon statement said China resumed its coercive interference in Vietnam's long-standing oil and gas activities in the South China Sea. And if anyone knows a thing or two about coercive interference for oil, it's the U.S. military. What you're looking at isn't footage from some upcoming sci-fi movie. This is an autonomous passenger drone made by the Chinese company Yihang. It could be the first company in the world to start regular flights on pilotless passenger drones. But do you really want your pilotless drone being built and controlled by a Chinese company which, by law, has ties to the Communist Party? I can just imagine some Falun Gong practitioner on his way to the grocery store suddenly rerouted to a labor camp, where he'll be lifted out of poverty. So you see, these drones aren't from a sci-fi movie, they're from a real-life horror movie. I'd rather fly on this plane full of durians. But the Yihang drone nightmare may not be coming to the U.S. anytime soon. The The Pentagon recently banned the use of drones built by China's DJI and may soon ban all Chinese-built drones and Chinese-manufactured components from military use. And if it ends up being anything like the Chinese telecom company Huawei, the military ban could someday become a consumer ban as well. The officially atheist Chinese Communist Party has just ordained its first Catholic bishop in China under a new deal with the Vatican. You might be asking yourself, wait, what? Well, the Chinese Communist Party has always insisted it had the right to appoint Catholic bishops in China. Look, it makes no sense, but that's just how the party operates. But over the past several years, the Vatican has been working on a pretty great deal that will benefit Catholics living in one of the most oppressive countries for Christians in the world. The Vatican will now allow the Communist Party to appoint bishops. In exchange, the Vatican gets to help make the Chinese Communist Party look good. This is what Beijing calls win-win mutual cooperation. If only the leaders of other countries were so good at making deals. As it is, during the recent G7 meeting, Britain, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the United States all issued a joint statement telling China to cut out its oppression in Hong Kong. The statement said, the G7 reaffirms the existence and importance of the 1984 Sino-British Agreement on Hong Kong and calls for avoiding violence. The Sino-British Agreement was a deal between China and the UK that the UK would give Hong Kong to China under the condition that Hong Kong could keep its freedoms for 50 years. China later said that has no meaning. I guess they had their fingers crossed behind their back when they made the deal. Unfortunately, international law permits that kind of thing. Good news for Australian author Yang Heng-jun. After being detained for 7 months in China on undisclosed charges, he's finally learned why he's being detained. Turns out, it's on espionage charges. Wow, what a master spy. It took China 7 months to figure out what they had arrested him for. Amazing. It has nothing to do with the fact the author is considered a dedicated democracy activist who believed that China's autocratic system would, with time, necessarily liberalize. Yang has been an Australian citizen since 2002, but still held a Chinese passport, which means in the eyes of the Chinese Communist Party, Yang belongs to China. Speaking of spycraft, according to the New York Times, China has been using LinkedIn to recruit spies. Great, like we needed more recruiters on LinkedIn. Can't wait to hear about another new and exciting opportunity. But wait, why is China using LinkedIn? Instead of dispatching spies to the US to recruit a single target, it's more efficient to sit behind a computer in China and send out friend requests to thousands of targets using fake profiles. You know, now I'm second guessing if I should have given all that top secret info to my new LinkedIn friend, American Joe. He seems like he's on the level. Bad news for VPN users in China. A 26-year-old was just sentenced to 7 years in prison for sharing VPN software. He had been sharing it on popular messaging sites in China. Police found those messages and then found him using his phone's geographical positioning. That's horrible, terrifying, and also, I want to know what VPN he was using because I don't think it works very well. This is just the latest in an ongoing crackdown on VPNs in China. I mean, what's the point of having a draconian internet censorship firewall if people can just jump over the wall? The Confucius Institute, a Chinese language program with schools and classes all over the world. Well, the education minister in New Brunswick, Canada, decided to end his school system's relationship with the Confucius Institute because of its ties to the Chinese government. Then he received a visit from a top Chinese diplomat. He told me about how the Confucius Institute had nothing at all to do with Chinese government, then very strongly expressed concerns this might adversely impact trade relationships with China and the Chinese government. I don't know how Canadian officials saw through the Chinese diplomat's ploy. It was foolproof. Come to think of it, that's the same message my LinkedIn friend American Joe has been telling me. Costco opened its first store in China on Tuesday, and it was chaos. There was a 3-hour wait just for parking. When the gates opened, people literally crawled their way in. It got so bad, local police had to be called in. They demanded people be rational. Rational. Rational in Costco? I don't think so. I need a king-size mattress and 5 gallons of Kirkland Signature ranch dressing, and I need them now. Ultimately, the store was forced to close 8 hours early. And as the Wall Street Journal points out, what trade war? And finally, according to a group of Chinese academics, the English language, and somehow by proxy all Western civilization, originated from China. The evidence? Yellow in English sounds a bit like yellow, which is the word for falling leaves, but backwards. Shop sounds vaguely similar to shangpu. Heart and head begin with the letters he, as a nod to he, meaning core in 20th century pinyin. Yes, China invented gunpowder, the compass, and all of Western civilization, but especially Shakespeare. Everything has been part of China since ancient times. And stay tuned after the break. Hong Kong's chief executive has withdrawn the controversial extradition bill right after a secret audio recording of her was leaked to the press. Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. I have some advice for Hong Kong's chief executive, Carrie Lam. If you propose a bill that's so unpopular, a quarter of the city comes out to protest, and if you refuse to answer any of the protesters' demands, and if you become so hated that you have to physically hide from the public, then I suggest you ought to deal with public discontent as swiftly as possible and not wait nearly 3 months. But better late than never, some would say, because on Wednesday, Carrie Lam finally announced that she would withdraw the extradition bill that could send criminal suspects to mainland China for trial.
The government will formally withdraw the bill in order to fully allay public concerns.
Unfortunately, this does not fully allay public concerns. It might have had she withdrawn it immediately after 1 million people protested back on June 9th, but now the Hong Kong people are upset over a pretty wide range of things, like police violence against protesters. That's why the protesters have 5 key demands for the Hong Kong government. So with only one of those demands met, it's just not enough for most protesters. Also, the timing is a little odd. Lam withdrew the extradition bill just days after a secret recording of her was leaked to the public. The recording came from a private talk she gave last week at a luncheon. I'm going to play the whole 4-minute recording for you because it's a fascinating glimpse into what Carrie Lam is actually thinking.
I don't want to spend your time or waste your time for you to ask me what went wrong and why went wrong. But for a chief executive to have caused this huge havoc to Hong Kong is unforgivable. It's just unforgivable. If I have a choice, the first thing is to quit. Having made a deep apology is to step down. So I make a plea to you for your forgiveness. I'll be very honest with you. It would be naive for me to paint you a rosy picture that things will be fine or I had a deadline. But I can assure you that Beijing does not have a deadline. They know this will prolong. So we have made special arrangements. There will be a 1st of October National Day celebrations, but still having a lot of disruptions. So we are going for a modest but solemn type of celebrations on the 1st of October, which means that they and ourselves have no expectation that we could clear up this thing before the 1st of October. Another thing I want to assure you that is my own feeling the pulse and through discussions, CBG has absolutely no plan to send in the PLA. But the first, of course, I'm sure in your heart you will feel, and I'm sure a large number of people feel that I do have a solution, and that is a political one. But I have to tell you that this is where the crux of the matter lies. Once an issue has been elevated to a national level, to a sort of sovereignty and security level, let alone in the midst of this sort of unprecedented tension between the 2 big economies in the world. The political room for the chief executive, who unfortunately has to serve 2 masters by constitution, that is the Central People's Government and the people of Hong Kong. that political room for maneuvering is very, very, very limited. They care about the country's international profile. It has taken China a long time to build up to that sort of international profile and to have some say, not only being a big economy, but a responsible big economy. So to forsake all those positive developments is clearly not on their agenda. But they are willing to play it long. They are willing to play it long. So you have no short-term solution. Hong Kong suffers. You lose tourism, economy, you lose your IPOs, and so, but can't do much about it. But after everything has been settled, the country will be there to help with maybe positive measures, especially in the Greater Bay Area. And nowadays, it's extremely difficult for me to go out. I have not been on the streets, not in the shopping malls, can't go to a hair salon, can't do anything, because my whereabouts will be spread around on the social media, the Telegram, the Lindang Wang, and you could expect a big crowd of black t-shirts and black mask young people waiting for me.
There's a lot to unpack there. 1, she said the first thing she would do is quit if she had a choice, but she does not, implying that the higher-ups won't let her. 2, she said that the Central People's Government has no plans to send in the People's Liberation Army. Instead, they're willing to play the long game and let Hong Kong's economy suffer as the protests drag on. Of course, Lam said that partly based on feeling the pulse, and I'm not sure I'd bet on her ability to feel the pulse of anything, including at this point, herself. 3, she admits out loud that her hands are tied because she has to serve two masters, the Chinese Communist Party and the people of Hong Kong, although we all know which master really counts. And 4, she can't even go to the hair salon because those protesters would be waiting, so life is pretty tough for Carrie Lam. Now, after this audio was leaked to the public, she did what any self-respecting politician would do. She held a press conference to deny the whole thing. This is what she said on Tuesday.
I have never tendered a resignation to the Central People's Government. I have not even contemplated to discuss a resignation with the Central People's Government. The choice of not resigning is my own choice.
That's a brilliantly worded denial. It can be technically true that she never tendered a resignation, while also being totally misleading because she might have never tendered a resignation because she was already told not to. When a reporter tried to question her on the specifics of that, she did what any self-respecting politician would do. She denied it again and walked away.
Your answer does not arise. I have never tendered any resignation.
Thank you very much.
But you have to feel a little bad for Carrie Lam. Not because she can't get her hair done, but it is pretty hard to say that you didn't say the things that you did say when someone publishes the audio of the things you really did say. On the other hand, the leaked audio might not be so bad for Lam. Sure, it shows that she's the helpless puppet of the Chinese Communist Party. But since she's not calling the shots, she can wriggle out of the ultimate responsibility. And this also illustrates a larger problem that Hong Kong faces. The people can protest all they want, and they do. And Carrie Lam can even eventually give in to one of the protesters' 5 key demands, withdrawing the extradition bill. But it's not enough, because ultimately, all the key decisions being made about Hong Kong are not in the hands of the Hong Kong government. The decisions are being made by Beijing. But if the Chinese Communist Party thinks that withdrawing the bill is going to be enough to stop the protests, then they're not feeling the pulse of the protesters, especially because Lam did not agree to an independent investigation into police brutality, something that's angered protesters and ordinary Hong Kongers the most. But don't worry. After Hong Kong police chased protesters into the MTR, beating and pepper spraying anyone who happened to be on the trains, wrestled a protester to the ground until he passed out, and then chased and tackled students on a playground, Beijing knows exactly what to do. Yes, they're talking about outlawing masks for protesters, and punishing teachers for heinous crimes, and introducing patriotic education into Hong Kong schools. It's not like trying to do that in 2012 led to citywide protests. Yes, the Chinese Communist Party has got this handled. Thanks for watching China Uncensored. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.